Hey everybody. So this is a really fast video on just scientific literature. I know we've started reading Miss Sung's paper, but we're kind of going to continue. So let's go over some of the parts. So, what is scientific literature? Scientific literature is what we call the body of peer-reviewed work. So, I think you remember from when we went over the scientific method that the last step in the scientific method is you have to share your findings. Doing that used to take place in conferences and talks and stuff like that, but now it mostly takes place by being peer reviewed, having someone, another scientist, review your work and then it getting published. So these pictures are three examples of peer reviewed papers. The one on the bottom left is from Nature. Nature was the first scientific journal. Before this, scientists used to just get together at meetings and talk. But starting in the 1800s, scientists all over Europe would send letters, they called it, but it was really research papers, to Nature and they would publish them. Science was the American version of this. You can actually go and see some of the really old journal articles at Rutgers if you ever get there. They have like the first few magazine articles from Science and philosophical transactions. These are all still in publication today, which is kind of interesting. One of the things we do have to keep in mind is that the word research has different meanings in different fields. So, in science, when we say a research project, what we mean is a piece of experimentation. And in other fields, like especially the humanities, research, which kind of etymologically really should mean space search, they're looking up what other people have already written. Just keep in mind that they're not the same. We also have reviews of other people's sources, but we call those reviews the lit. Oh, excuse my dog. Um, and then there's also the types. So primary literature, aka the ones on an experiment, is a single report on a single experiment. These are most of the journal articles you'll see um, in scientific articles will be in journals will be a piece of original research, an experiment. The other place you can come across these is if you get to a research library, like in a college, is a thesis. Theses tend to be much longer, usually 100 pages or so, and they're bound, but most universities have a section in them where the people who went to college there have their theses published. In tech, which you've probably learned a little bit about from Miss Morsitz and Miss Green last year, um, was that tech has patents and reports of of experimental um, engineering designs and things like that. So tech has their own version of primary lit. Economics has these things called white papers that kind of look like scientific papers as a field, and they're common in economics, but they are not peer reviewed, so no white papers. One of the things that trips kids up is when we get to secondary research. So scientists also do reviews of other people's findings. That's called a review of the lit. So in a secondary source that you might come across as a review of the lit, this green book over here, which is actually one of the ones I have in my lab, is a collection of primary sources that have been put together because they're all about the same thing. In this case, biology and conservation, horseshoe crabs. This book is a secondary source, not a primary source. Finally, the last sources are the ones where you like tertiary sources, websites, newspaper articles. Those would be tertiary. Scientific lit can also be split up the same way we split up scientific research, descriptive versus experimental. Descriptive answers the what question, what happened, how many animals are in this location, what is the condition of this forest right now, things like that. Experimental research is why. Why did what would happen when rotifers are exposed to different temperatures? And the difference is whether you're testing a hypothesis or whether you're surveying. And they're both equally relevant no matter what our friend Lord Rutherford said. Keep that in mind as you're going through scientific literature, whether you're using descriptive or experimental. Today in science, there are more than 30,000 journals. It is a business to publish now. And they tend to be centered on a field. We still have the major top tier journals like Science and Nature, which is just where the most relevant research of any field is published. But they tend to be tiered. There's the like in oceanography, there's literally the top journal in marine science or oceanography is called Limnology, and then they get lower and lower from there. And one of the problems is because it is a business, um, there are unscrupulous people who establish journals, and we call it pay to play. It's really pay to publish. Some scientists, all scientists in the working research field, are under pressure to. It's called publish or perish. To publish new findings and bring glory and honor to the um, research institution that they work at. So there are junk journals out there where literally people will pay money to publish. It's hard to avoid them, especially if you don't know about them. So it is possible you'll find articles that I have to tell you can't use because it's a junk journal, but it's something to keep in mind. This publish or perish has given rise to a phenomenon of, as you know, repeating a study is really important to make sure that what you found is true. But it's expensive, and very little is done to. We rely much more heavily on the peer review part and much less on the replication, which unfortunately is problematic. You're going to watch another video about that because peer review is the best system we have. Peer review is responsible for all of the modern discoveries in science, everything from medications to technology and so on. But it is a flawed system. It is not perfect. It is subject to human bias and fraud because it's run by people. That's what this picture is of. These two dogs are Snuppy and Snoopy. And this is a very famous and case of fraud that made it through peer review. There's a scientist who claimed he had cloned dogs, and he produced as evidence these two dogs. He claimed that this puppy was a clone of this older dog. It turns out it wasn't. It was just his son. Um, but the man was under a huge amount. He'd taken millions and millions of dollars in fees and grants and had no findings, hadn't made progress. Cloning is very hard. And he was under so much pressure to publish or perish that he fraudulently claimed he had been able to do it. The irony is, even though he made it through peer review, when they went to replicate his study, nobody could. And because it was a very prestigious study, they did try to replicate it and they couldn't. So even though it is flawed, the system usually catches itself in self right. So it was peer review that discovered that this fraud had taken place. But do some smaller studies or any studies slip through the cracks? It's possible. It's something we have to work on. Parts of a primary source. Um, you should know these: the title, the author, the abstract. That is the block texted paragraph in the beginning. That's a summary. Then introduction, method, results, discussion are just parts of those four questions. One of the things I'll point out to you here is if you're concerned that you may have a review paper instead of a research paper, there'll be no methods. The methods section is where they talk about they did a review of the lit doesn't do anything. They just read other people's papers. So always look for a method section when you're trying to find a primary source. And then the works cited. So those are parts of a primary source. And we've already started reading Miss Sung's paper. So that's where we're at for today. And I'll see you tomorrow.